Keanu Reeves bought his mother her dream house by the ocean. But this wasn't just a gift. It was a silent apology, a final promise, and the one thing he swore he'd do before it was too late. But when she stepped inside, "Whoa, she," whispered left everyone frozen in tears. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The clock on the wall ticked softly in Keanu Reeves's dimly lit living room. Outside, the streets of Los Angeles were quiet, the hum of the city dulled to a whisper beneath the late hour. Most of the world had long since gone to sleep, but not Keanu. He sat alone, barefoot, cross-legged on the hardwood floor, surrounded by scattered photo albums. His fingers gently traced the edges of a worn leather album resting in his lap. The pages had yellowed with time, and the photos inside were curling at the corners. Each image was a memory, some blurry, some faded, but all permanent in his heart. He turned a page and paused. There it was, a photo he hadn't looked at in years. He was maybe 9, standing awkwardly in a doorway with a crooked grin. His jeans were too short, his sleeves too long, and behind him stood a woman whose strength radiated even in stillness. His mother, Patricia Reeves, stood in the background of the frame, her hands on her hips, eyes soft but tired. The apartment they lived in was small, just 2 cramped rooms with peeling paint and a heater that only worked when it wanted to. The edges of the photograph were frayed, but the moment it captured was etched perfectly into his memory. Keanu leaned closer, his eyes settling on his mother's face. Even in the grainy photograph, her exhaustion was unmistakable, yet she was smiling. He remembered the day that photo was taken. They had just finished moving into that run-down apartment. The landlord had warned them the hot water was unreliable, and there was a crack in the bedroom window that let in the cold. But Patricia had unpacked a box of chipped mugs, lined them up on a shelf like priceless china, and said, "We'll make it beautiful." Keanu remembered sitting with her that night on the worn-out couch, both of them wrapped in the same old blanket, as they flipped through a home magazine she'd pulled from the community library. On one glossy page was a photo of a coastal home, wide windows, a garden of wildflowers, gentle cliffs sloping toward the ocean. "Someday," she said quietly, her voice more hopeful than confident. "I'd love a house like that, nothing fancy, just peace, a little garden, a breeze through the windows, room for the kids to visit. That'd be enough for me." She'd said it so casually, almost like it was a throwaway dream. But Keanu had never forgotten it. Now, decades later, he was still carrying that memory, still hearing the gentle way she said peace, like it was the rarest thing in the world. He closed the photo album and stared out the window. The city lights blinked from far-off skyscrapers, but he wasn't really seeing them. His thoughts were thousands of miles away, somewhere near the ocean, where the wind didn't sound like traffic and the air didn't smell like exhaust. Somewhere that could finally give his mother what she gave him. Sanctuary. He stood up slowly and walked across the room to a small wooden desk. He opened the top drawer and pulled out a sheet of stationery. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. His mother's. A shopping list, decades old. On the back of the paper was a doodle, a rough sketch of a house, boxy and uneven, drawn in his childish scrawl. A little note scribbled underneath read, "Mom's dream house, someday." He stared at it for a long time, feeling his throat tighten. Patricia had never asked for anything, not when she was raising 2 children on a waitress's wages, not when she sold her wedding ring to pay the rent, not even when Keanu first started booking film roles and offered to buy her a new apartment. She always said the same thing, "Spend it on something meaningful. I'm fine." But now, he couldn't stop thinking about time, how fast it moved, how quietly it slipped away while people were busy waiting for the right moment. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he needed, Lorenzo. His assistant, but more than that, a confidant, someone who had quietly helped coordinate everything from script reviews to personal charity efforts. someone he trusted to move mountains and stay quiet doing it. The screen glowed as the phone rang once, twice. "Keanu?" Lorenzo's voice came through, groggy but alert. It was 1:42 a.m. "Sorry to call this late," Keanu said, his voice soft. "I couldn't wait." "No problem at all. What's going on?" Keanu hesitated for a second, as if giving his heart one last chance to back out. But it didn't. "It's time," he said firmly. "I want to find it." There was a pause on the line. "The house?" Keanu exhaled slowly. "Yeah, the one she always dreamed of. By the water. Simple, peaceful, with space for a garden and maybe a guest room or two. I want to give it to her." Lorenzo's voice changed. "You're I've been carrying this too long," Keanu said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She gave me everything and never asked for anything in return. Not once. She deserves this." Lorenzo was already switching gears. Coastal or lake? Contemporary or cottage style? "Ocean," Keanu replied without hesitation. She always loved the ocean. Somewhere quiet, big windows, a place where the sound of the waves drowns out the noise of the world. "I'll start looking first thing in the morning." "No," Keanu said. "Start now." There was a beat of silence before Lorenzo said, "On it." Keanu ended the call and stood motionless, the phone still in his hand. He walked back to the photo album, opened it to the page with the old apartment photo, and sat down on the floor again. He placed the page flat, gently pressing the corners. "You said someday," he whispered. "Let's make it today." And in that stillness, surrounded by fading photos and fragile memories, something shifted. This wasn't just about fulfilling a promise. It was about coming full circle. The boy who once dreamed of changing the world had grown into the man who could finally change hers. 2 days later, Keanu stood at the edge of a cliffside trail in Big Sur, the wind tugging gently at his jacket. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, a blanket of blue unraveling into the horizon. Below, waves crashed against jagged rocks in a slow, rhythmic pulse that somehow quieted everything inside him. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, not even Lorenzo. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to feel it. Behind him stood a modest house, partially hidden among Monterey pines and wild coastal shrubs. The structure wasn't grand or flashy, exactly what had drawn him to it. One story, weathered shingles, large windows that looked out over the sea, a small garden space in the back, overgrown but full of possibility. It didn't shout for attention, it whispered. It looked peaceful, just like his mother had always wanted. He took a slow breath and imagined her here, sitting on the back deck with a book and a cup of tea, opening the kitchen windows to let the sea air in, digging her hands into soil again, planting herbs the way she used to when he was little. This could be it. He took a few photos with his phone, angles of the garden, the view from the front porch, the way the afternoon sun filtered through the trees. Then he turned and walked back toward the gravel driveway, already dialing. "Sophia," he said as soon as the line picked up. "I need you." A beat passed. Then came her voice, warm, sharp, and instantly curious. "Keanu Reeves. That's not a call I get every day. What's going on?" "I found a house," he said simply. "Big Sur. It's almost perfect." "For you?" she asked. "For my mom," he said. There was a pause. "Okay," Sophia replied. "Tell me everything." Keanu sat in the driver's seat of his truck and stared out at the sea while he spoke. He told her about the photo album, about the dream his mother had held onto for decades without ever asking for it. About how it wasn't just about real estate. It was about finally honoring everything she gave him. He told her the house needed work, but not too much. Mostly it needed heart. "Not a mansion," he said firmly. "Not something that screams money. I want it to feel like it's always been hers, like we just peeled back time and found her dream waiting." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, I can do that. What's the timeline?" 6 weeks. Now she laughed. 6 weeks? You're insane. Probably, he said. But it has to be ready before her birthday. That's non-negotiable. I assume you want to keep it a surprise? Completely. She can't know. Not until it's finished. Sophia sighed. All right. You'll need permits, a crew, suppliers, decor, furniture, landscaping. I know. And I want you to oversee all of it. Every detail. But Sophia, listen, absolute secrecy. No one outside your team and mine can know. I get it. Consider my lips sealed. They spent the next 30 minutes going over logistics. Keanu had already contacted the owner and arranged to pay above asking price for immediate possession. Lorenzo had begun setting up the legal side. Now, with Sophia on board, it was time to bring the vision to life. The next morning, Sophia arrived at the property with a camera, a sketchbook, and a team of consultants in tow. Keanu was already there, pacing the front porch. I walked through again this morning, he said. It's got good bones. The layout makes sense. I think we can make it work. Sophia nodded, scanning the house with her designer's eye. The bones are there, yeah, but it's tired. The inside's dated. Needs warmth, light, maybe new floors. I trust you, Keanu said. But remember, this isn't for show. She's practical, thoughtful. She doesn't want luxury. She wants comfort. Something she can live in, not pose in. Sophia smiled. Don't worry. I've designed for celebrities who want gold bathtubs and invisible closets. This is refreshing, real. They began walking through the house together, room by room. Keanu paused often to explain little things his mother loved. The scent of lavender, cozy reading corners, soft blue tones, kitchens where everyone could gather. She used to say the best room in any house is the one with the best stories, he said. Usually the kitchen. Sophia jotted notes furiously. So, storytelling architecture, got it. And the garden, Keanu added. She needs space to grow herbs and flowers. That matters more than a swimming pool or whatever's trending. They stood in the overgrown backyard as he pointed out the southern-facing side where the sun lingered longest. Build her something here, he said. Raised beds, a trellis, something she can tend without straining. Done, Sophia said. What about the guest rooms? She wants her grandkids to visit, her siblings too, make them feel welcome. As the day wore on, the scope of the project expanded, but Keanu never flinched. When Sophia hesitated over budget, he waved it off. Don't think like a designer, he told her. Think like a son trying to repay a lifetime of sacrifice. By day's end, Sophia had a full plan in place. She'd already scheduled contractors and furniture suppliers. A crew would begin work the next morning. Paint samples would be delivered by noon. But there was one final detail that couldn't wait. You need to tell her something, Sophia said. She'll get suspicious. You're always calling her. I'll figure it out, Keanu replied. Maybe I'll say I'm filming up north for a while. Buy myself time. Whatever you do, Sophia said, don't slip. Surprises like this only happen once. He nodded. That's why it has to be perfect. Over the following days, the transformation began in earnest. Trucks arrived at dawn. The old floors were pulled up, windows replaced, walls repainted in soft grays and blues. The kitchen was stripped down to its studs, making way for new cabinetry, better light, and a generous island at its heart. The bedrooms were redone with plush carpets and neutral tones, every detail designed for comfort. The garden was cleared and tilled, the foundation for raised beds installed. And Keanu? He showed up nearly every day. He didn't just supervise, he worked. Painting, lifting, cleaning. The crew grew used to seeing him in jeans and a flannel, hauling lumber or ranging flower pots with startling care. Lorenzo managed deliveries and suppliers, coordinating schedules to the minute. Sophia made daily site visits, fussing over trim and texture, debating whether a particular throw pillow felt too staged. Keanu watched her work and smiled. The project was moving fast, but not fast enough. On a rainy Thursday morning, Sophia called him with a concern. "We're on track," she said, "but barely. One bad storm and we lose time." Keanu exhaled slowly. "Then we work through it." "And what about her birthday?" "She still thinks I'm filming in Vancouver. I've got Lorenzo forwarding my mail and taking video calls in a body double setup." "That's insane." "It's worth it." There was a pause. "You really love her," Sophia said. Keanu smiled. "She saved my life, not once, over and over." One afternoon, after the new windows were installed and the kitchen tile finally laid, Keanu stood in the living room, watching the light pour through the glass. It was starting to feel real. He walked over to the corner where a bookshelf would soon stand and placed a small envelope behind a loose panel. Inside was a note, written in his handwriting, folded tightly. It said, "For all the nights you stayed up for me, for every time you went without so I didn't have to, for every smile you gave me when your world was falling apart. This is for you, Mom." As the sun dipped below the Pacific and the salty air drifted in, Keanu stepped onto the back deck, his hands in his pockets. The dream was becoming tangible. A house by the water, a place to breathe, a promise kept. And Patricia? She had no idea what was coming. The old floorboards in Keanu's memory creaked the same way they had decades ago, every step echoing through the cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Toronto. He could still smell the faint scent of starch and fabric glue clinging to the walls like wallpaper. It was always cold in winter, and the radiator barely worked, but somehow the tiny space had always felt like home. He was 8 years old, legs crossed on the thin carpet, surrounded by thread spools and chalk marks. His mother, Patricia, sat hunched over her sewing machine at the small kitchen table, glasses slipping down her nose, her fingers moving with quiet precision. The machine buzzed, hesitated, buzzed again. Keanu watched in awe. His mother was like magic. She could take scraps and shape them into something beautiful. Patricia Reeves had a smile that defied exhaustion. She wore it like armor. Even after hours stitching clothes for department stores, even when tips at the diner were short, even when the landlord banged on the door for late rent, she smiled at her son like the world was still kind. "You hungry, baby?" she asked without looking up. Keanu nodded. "A little. We've got pancake mix, dinner pancakes, how about that?" He remembered how she said it, like it was an adventure. Like eating pancakes at night was something special. At the time, he didn't understand why there wasn't anything else in the fridge, why she'd spent her last $5 on syrup instead of eggs, but he never questioned it. Her eyes told him everything was okay, that she had it handled. Later, he'd understand that she was holding everything together with threads thinner than the ones she sewed with. That night, while they ate pancakes on the floor because the kitchen chairs had broken and never been replaced, Patricia told him stories. She had a voice that could paint pictures in the air. She talked about Greece, about the village her grandmother had grown up in, about blue oceans and wild thyme and goats that wandered into courtyards. "Someday," she said, flipping the last pancake, "you'll go see all of it. The world is bigger than this apartment, baby, bigger than this whole city. But don't ever let it change your heart." Keanu looked up at her with wide eyes. "I won't. Just don't forget where you came from," she added softly. "Don't forget the small spaces that held your big dreams." He never did. Years passed, but the memory of her sacrifices clung to him like a second skin. By the time he was 16, Keanu had started working odd jobs, cleaning theater sets, running errands, hauling gear for local musicians, anything to help out. But no matter how long her hours were, Patricia never asked him to quit school, never let him give up on acting. Not once. She'd come home after double shifts, feet swollen and shoulders aching, and still ask how his auditions went. She memorized every monologue with him, practiced lines while flipping burgers. When a casting agent once told Keanu he didn't look like a lead, Patricia had snapped, "Good thing he's not just a look, he's a heart." She'd always believed in him harder than he believed in himself. One night he came home to find her asleep at the table, a stack of overdue bills beside her and her head resting on her arms. The diner apron was still tied around her waist. Her hands were stained with coffee and bleach. Keanu stood there for a long time, not wanting to wake her. Instead, he pulled out the blanket from the sofa and draped it gently over her shoulders. Then he picked up the bills and started writing down a plan. He was going to make it. Somehow, for her. It was always for her. Years later, after speed made him a household name and money began flowing in like a dam had burst, Keanu tried to repay her. He sent checks, offered to pay off debts, tried to get her to move into a bigger apartment. But Patricia refused most of it. "I'm proud of you," she'd say, "but I've got what I need. You just keep being you." She never wanted flash, never wanted to live through her son's fame. She was happiest planting petunias in a windowsill box, listening to Sinatra records, or watching old movies with a cup of tea. When Keanu bought himself his first sports car, she didn't scold him, but she raised an eyebrow. "Does it fly?" "No." Then I'd have gone with the one that came with a trunk. That was Patricia, practical, fiercely independent, grateful but never greedy. One afternoon, years after he'd become a star, he stopped by her tiny apartment unannounced. She was on the floor again, repotting an herb garden because the basil had outgrown its container. "Still can't sit still, huh?" he teased. She looked up at him, dirt on her cheek. "Keeps me sane. Plants don't ask for anything but care." He sat beside her, watching her hands work through the soil. He had just come off a grueling shoot, action scenes, night filming, press tours, and all he wanted was this moment. Just her and him, the dirt, and the plants. That day, as the sun filtered through the sheer curtains and the smell of earth filled the room, Keanu noticed a magazine tucked beneath one of the flower pots. The page was open to a house, a small seaside cottage with white shutters and a garden. "You still read Coastal Living?" he asked. Patrice smiled, a little sheepish. "I like the colors." He pulled the magazine toward him and studied the photo. The house was surrounded by lavender bushes and a winding stone path. There were rocking chairs on the porch, and through the open door, you could see the ocean beyond. "This what you want?" he asked. She shrugged. "It's just a picture, one of those silly dreams." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The lines around her eyes had deepened, and her hands were worn, but her spirit, that was the same. Unbreakable, gentle, wise. "Silly dreams," he repeated. "You never asked for anything." "Because I had everything that mattered," she said simply. "You, your sister, a roof, food, laughter. What else could I want?" Keanu didn't say anything. He just folded the magazine carefully, slid it into his jacket pocket, and kissed her on the forehead. Years later, he'd still have that page. Faded, soft around the edges, but always with him. And now, standing in the house in Big Sur as contractors buzzed around him, that memory burned in his chest. This wasn't just about repaying a debt. It wasn't about guilt or duty. It was about honoring a life that had given so much and asked for so little. A life of quiet resilience and fierce love. He thought back to those pancake dinners, the broken chairs, the nights his mother came home looking like the world had worn her thin, and still asked how he was doing. The house he was building wasn't just made of wood and paint. It was made of those memories, of every sleepless night she endured, every dream she set aside so his could grow. As the kitchen was installed and the garden beds took shape, Keanu added a final request to Sophia. "I want a wall," he said, "somewhere in the house, with pictures." "Of what?" "Her life," he said, "not just me. I want photos of her when she was younger, laughing, working, holding me, holding my sister. I want her story to live on the walls of this house." Sophia nodded. "We'll make it a gallery, a celebration." And they did. Each room began to reflect Patricia's essence. Soft fabrics, earthy tones, handwritten labels on herb jars. a cozy armchair by a bay window, just big enough for her and a blanket. Nothing showy, everything real. Outside, lavender bushes were planted along the front path. The porch was fitted with rocking chairs. The garden gate bore a small brass plaque that read, "For the woman who grew hope in every season." Keanu stood in the living room one evening just before the final coat of paint was applied. He was exhausted, but content. He looked around at the soft light, the peaceful tones, the gentle hum of possibility. She was going to walk in here and see everything she'd never dared ask for. A sanctuary, a gift, a thank you wrapped in walls and windows. And in that moment, with the ocean whispering outside and the house almost ready, Keanu whispered to the empty room, "You never stopped giving, Mom. Now it's my turn." The early morning sun poured through the tall windows of Keanu's Big Sur rental as he sat at the long oak table, fingers resting on his phone screen, hesitant. Outside, waves whispered against the cliffside, and the scent of salt and pine hung thick in the air. Inside, though, a quiet tension filled the room. The house project was moving forward, walls framed, garden beds sketched, but something was missing. He stared at his phone for another few seconds, then finally tapped call. It rang once, twice, then clicked. "Keanu?" His sister's voice came through, warm, slightly groggy. "You okay?" "I'm good, just been thinking about Mom," he said. "Got a second?" "For you. Always." He smiled at that. Emily Reeves had always been the family's emotional compass. Soft, where Keanu was quiet, intuitive, where he leaned stoic. They'd survived childhood together. Now she was a school counselor, living in Portland, with 2 kids and a kitchen filled with houseplants and music. "I'm building something," he began. "For Mom, that house by the ocean she always dreamed of. I found the place." There was a beat of silence, then a sharp inhale. "No," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "You didn't." "I did. It's perfect. Big Sur, cliffside, ocean view, garden potential, quiet, peaceful." Emily was crying now. He could hear it. "She's never asked for anything," she said. "Not a single thing, in our whole lives." "I know," Keanu said softly. "And she gave up everything for us." "That's why I'm doing this," he said. "But I need your help." Emily sniffled, already moving through her house, the tone of her footsteps shifting. Practical, focused, determined. "Tell me what you need." Keanu leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the sun finally settling on his shoulders. "Memories. Details. I want the house to feel like it's always been hers, not just a gift, not a showpiece. A place that feels like she dreamed it into existence. I want it to smell like her, feel like her." Emily exhaled shakily. "Okay. I have her old journals. Remember those little spiral notebooks she used to keep in the drawer by the bed? The ones she scribbled in while waiting for the laundry? Yeah. I found a box of them when I moved last year. I kept them all." Keanu's voice grew quieter. "Do you think there's anything in them about the house?" "I don't just think," Emily said. "I know." She was already pulling the plastic storage bin from the top of her closet. It was labeled in black marker, Mom's Notes. The lid popped off with a soft crack, and inside were dozens of worn notebooks, some with frayed edges, others with faded covers. "I'll call you tonight," she said. "Give me a few hours to read through." Keanu hung up, and for the first time in days, he felt a deeper sense of direction. That evening, just as the sky turned from coral to indigo, Emily called back. Her voice was thick with emotion. "I've been reading for hours, Keanu. It's all in here." He sat upright in his armchair, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she didn't just dream about that house. She planned it, sketched it out in words, in little lists, in quiet whispers to herself. Stuff we never saw." Emily began to read aloud. "Dream home wish list," she said softly, flipping pages. "Light blue curtains, a garden with rosemary and thyme, A porch where I can drink coffee and listen to birds. Room for my kids and their kids, if they want to stay the weekend. A kitchen with windows, bookshelves, a place for a dog. Keanu's chest ached. She wrote these during her night shifts, Emily continued. Some are on napkins, others are full entries. There's even a sketch, her version of a floor plan. Emily sent a photo of it to Keanu's phone. He opened it and stared in silence. The drawing was crude, childlike, just a rectangle with little boxes marked kitchen, bedroom, and herb garden. A tiny X in one corner was labeled favorite chair, but in the bottom right corner, 3 words were scribbled. One maybe. He rubbed a hand over his face. She never showed us this. Because she was busy making sure we had everything, Emily said, voice trembling. She gave us her dreams, piece by piece, and she never asked for anything back. Keanu swallowed hard. It's time we give it back. Emily wiped her eyes and sat down at her desk. Okay, here's what I've found so far. She began to list the items. A reading nook with a window seat. She always wanted that. Wooden floors, she said. Carpet felt like a trap for crumbs. A lavender bush near the bedroom window. She mentioned built-in shelves for her cookbooks, and tea drawers, like literal drawers, for loose-leaf tins. She once wrote, I'd love a place where it smells like lemon and wood polish, not bleach and steam. Keanu nodded after each one, taking mental notes. This is gold, Em. She wrote about a sunroom too, a space where she could stretch in the morning. Just big enough to move in, just bright enough to feel alive. His eyes stung. Tell me more. Emily flipped to another notebook. She dreamed of a place where she could age peacefully. She wrote, somewhere I can water plants, hum songs, maybe adopt a scruffy little mutt who'll love me even if I nap too much. Keanu laughed through a cracked voice. I can already see the dog. She wanted to paint again, Emily said suddenly, her tone shifting. Remember how she used to sketch when we were kids? She said, one day I'll have a studio with light and silence and no time cards. Keanu was silent. The weight of it all sat heavy on him. Keanu? Emily said gently. Are you okay? Yeah, he said quietly. I didn't know how much she held back. She didn't want us to feel like we had to fix her life. But she fixed ours. Emily paused, then said, this isn't just about building a house. This is about restoring her story, the one she buried under bills and burnt toast and double shifts. Exactly, Keanu whispered. Emily stood and walked to her window, the Portland rain tapping softly against the glass. She wrote, one day I'll have peace. Not quiet because I'm tired, but quiet because I'm full. Keanu closed his eyes. That's what I want her to have, he said, that kind of quiet. Emily took a breath. Then let's make every inch of this house whisper back to her that she's loved. They agreed to divide the work. Keanu would coordinate with Sophia, send in the structural and design team updates, and ensure the emotional vision stayed true. Emily would continue combing through the journals, sending photos, ideas, and even scent suggestions. She loved sandalwood and cedar, Emily noted. Used to hide those soaps in her dresser drawers, said they made the clothes smell like old bookstores. The next day, a box arrived at Keanu's temporary home in Big Sur. It was from Emily, filled with photocopies of Patricia's journals, old recipes, a swatch of those beloved blue curtains from their childhood kitchen, and a tiny fabric pouch filled with dried rosemary and lavender. Keanu opened the pouch and held it to his nose. The scent was immediate, powerful, time-traveling. He stood barefoot in the doorway of the house's future master bedroom, holding the scent to his face, imagining her there. Watering a plant, humming softly, reading in a sunlit chair. I'm building more than walls, he said out loud. I'm building her freedom. That night, Emily sent a final message before bed. She wrote something else, it read. Just one line, tucked in the back of a journal. Keanu opened the attached image. In shaky faded pencil, it read, if they ever ask, tell them I was happy. I just ran out of time for the dream." His reply was immediate. "Not anymore." And with that, Keanu Reeves, Hollywood star and quiet son, redoubled his resolve. The blueprint wasn't just architectural, it was emotional, generational. Each tile, each window, each beam of that dream house would carry her voice. And when she finally walked through the front door, every corner would say what words never had the chance to. "You are seen, you are cherished, and this is your time." The sun had barely begun its rise over the Pacific when Keanu's phone buzzed beside his bed. He sat up, disoriented for a second, then saw Sophia's name glowing on the screen. It was too early for anything good. He answered quickly. "Keanu, it's not good," she said, her voice clipped and tense. "The National Weather Service just issued a severe storm warning. It's heading straight for Big Sur. They're calling it one of the worst early season systems in a decade." He was already out of bed, tugging on jeans. "How much time?" 2 days, maybe less. But the wind's picking up now. We're already feeling it at the site. "I'll be there in 5 hours, he said, grabbing his bag without hesitation. "Don't stop work. Secure everything you can. We're not losing time." He hung up before she could protest. As he drove to the private airstrip outside Los Angeles, his mind was on Patricia, on the rosemary and lavender, the porch, the quiet because I'm full. This house wasn't just a surprise, it was a redemption of time, and no storm was going to steal that from her. By the time his plane landed in Monterey, the skies were already heavy with gray. Wind howled down the coast, bending trees and sending whitecaps crashing violently onto the cliffs below. Keanu didn't stop. He drove the winding stretch of Highway 1 with hands tight on the wheel, tires hugging the wet asphalt, until he reached the construction site nestled into the curve of the land. It was chaos. Tarps flapped violently. Buckets and tools had been blown across the gravel. The once orderly blueprint of Patricia's sanctuary was now a battlefield against the elements. Keanu stepped out of the car just as a gust of wind slammed into him, nearly knocking him back. Sophia ran up, rain jacket zipped to her chin, her clipboard soaked through. "You're insane," she said, shouting over the wind. "You didn't have to come." "Yes," he said simply, walking toward the house. "I did." By noon, the rain had arrived in full force. Keanu was in a pair of borrowed overalls, sleeves rolled up, hair plastered to his face, hammering plywood over the windows with the crew. No cameras, no entourage. Just him, soaked to the bone, teeth clenched in quiet resolve. A young carpenter named Miguel watched him in disbelief between swings of his own hammer. "Is that really him?" he asked Sophia. "Yeah," she said, tucking a wet strand of hair behind her ear. "And if you want to keep your job, I suggest you keep working." Inside, the framework groaned under the pressure of the storm. Buckets were placed strategically beneath new leaks in the unfinished ceiling. The scent of fresh lumber now mixed with damp earth and cold salt air. In the living room tubby, someone had scrawled, "Liberal Wall" on a wooden beam. Keanu traced his fingers over the letters as thunder rumbled in the distance. He turned to Julian, the lead contractor. "How bad is the roof?" Julian grimaced. "We reinforced it last week, but it's not sealed yet. We're going to lose some shingles, maybe some fascia. It's holding. For now, patch it however you have to," Keanu said. "But no delays. We finish on schedule." Julian hesitated. "Keanu, this could set us back days." "She waited decades," Keanu snapped, more force in his voice than anyone had heard from him all week. Then he softened. "We can't delay. Not for rain. Not for anything." Julian nodded. "Okay, I'll call in more crew. We'll work in shifts around the clock." "Good. I'll cover overtime, hazard pay, whatever it takes." As night fell, the storm only grew worse. The house groaned under the wind. The garden beds were washed out, the soil spilling over the edges like overfilled cups. The old oak near the edge of the property swayed dangerously. Inside, the team huddled in the skeletal frame of what would one day be Patricia's kitchen. A propane heater hissed warmth into the space. Keanu stood near the window, arms crossed, staring into the sheets of rain pounding the glass. Sophia handed him a steaming mug of black coffee. "She doesn't even know this exists," she said softly. "That's the point," Keanu replied. "She never expected anything, so we're giving her everything." At 2 a.m., a crash outside jolted everyone to attention. They rushed out into the rain and found a large portion of the roof torn back, exposing part of the master bedroom. Wind and water poured in, soaking insulation and drywall. "Get the tarp!" Keanu shouted, already climbing the temporary scaffolding. "We cover it now!" Julian tried to stop him. "You shouldn't be up there, man." "I'm not asking," Keanu said. He climbed onto the roof in the driving rain, gripping the beams for balance as lightning flashed in the distance. He worked side by side with the crew, pulling a thick black tarp over the exposed section and nailing it down with his bare hands, his soaked flannel shirt clinging to him like a second skin. Below, Sophia watched from the ground, equal parts awe and concern. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed. The house looked battered but standing. The crew had worked in rotating shifts through the night, repairing what they could, salvaging materials, drying what had been soaked. The garden would need replanting, but the structure, Patricia's future sanctuary, had survived. Keanu sat on the floor of what would become her sunroom, legs stretched out in front of him, sipping coffee with shaking hands. His knuckles were scraped, his body sore, but he was calm. Emily called just after sunrise. "I saw the news," she said, voice tight with worry. "Big Sir got hit hard." "We're okay," Keanu replied. "We lost part of the roof, some damage, nothing we can't fix." "Are you okay?" He paused. "I'm tired, wet, and I haven't felt this certain about anything in years." Emily exhaled. "She's going to be so overwhelmed." "That's the plan," he said quietly. Later that morning, the entire team met in the temporary trailer at the edge of the site. Sophia unrolled a revised blueprint, marking areas that needed immediate rework. Julian updated the schedule. Miguel passed out protein bars and water bottles. Keanu stood at the head of the table. "No delays," he said. "We hit our original deadline, no excuses. But if there's mold, or if the inspectors hold us back," Julian started. "Then we fix it faster. We bring in more people, we work smarter, but we do not delay." Sophia met his eyes. "Why are you pushing so hard?" Keanu glanced down at the blueprint, then back up at her. She never had time to dream out loud. "Because she was raising us, working 2 jobs, keeping food on the table when there was nothing left in the fridge. This house, it's not just a gift. It's a promise. And I'm not breaking it because of some rain." Silence filled the trailer. Then Miguel spoke up, quietly. "I'll stay the night. I can help reframe the garden beds." Another voice chimed in. "I've got family in roofing. I'll call them. They'll come." Julian nodded. "We'll bring in a second team, speed things up." Keanu nodded, gratitude in his eyes. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about someone who gave everything and never asked for anything in return." That afternoon, the clouds finally began to clear. The wind had calmed. The sun peeked through in bands, casting golden light on the broken soil and scaffolded frame. It was far from finished, but the bones were there, the soul was waiting. Keanu walked to the edge of the cliff and stood quietly, hands in his pockets. Below, the ocean roared. A sound he now associated not with fear or setbacks, but with resolve. He whispered, barely audible, "We're still on schedule, Mom." Behind him, the workers moved like clockwork, rebuilding what the storm had tried to steal. But the spirit of the house, the memory of pancakes for dinner, of a woman smiling through exhaustion, of journals filled with quiet wishes, that spirit had endured. Just like Patricia, and just like Keanu's promise, that no matter the weather, no matter the cost, her dream would rise. Patricia Reeves wasn't one to get rattled easily, but when she opened her email that quiet Tuesday morning and saw a message from her son that simply read, "I need you in California next Friday. It's important." She paused mid-sip of her tea. She read it again. No subject line, no further explanation, just the travel date and two words that struck deeper than most conversations ever could. It's important. She clicked reply and typed, "Of course. Is everything all right?" Before she could even stand to refill her tea, a new reply came through. "Yes. Don't worry. I'll have someone send the details. Just come. Please." That word, please, wasn't something Keanu used lightly. It meant this wasn't just important. It was personal. She didn't ask anything else, not because she wasn't curious, but because she had raised Keanu to carry his burdens until he was ready to share them, and when he was, she would always show up. The next few days passed slowly. Patricia moved through her modest Toronto apartment like a woman on the edge of something she couldn't name. She canceled her nutrition workshop at the community center and rescheduled a few Zoom consultations with clients who insisted they'd only talk to her. She didn't tell them why. She barely knew herself. By Thursday evening, her suitcase sat by the front door, light blue, scuffed at the corners. The same one she'd used for the past 10 years. Just 2 outfits, some toiletries, and a paperback she never finished. That was all she packed. Keanu always told her she underpacked, but she never liked feeling like she was staying too long. Her phone pinged that night, a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Reeves, this is Sophia. I'm coordinating your travel for Keanu. The car will arrive at 7:30 a.m. tomorrow to take you to the airport. Safe journey." No last name, no company, just Sophia. It was all so secretive. Patricia smiled to herself and shook her head. That boy's always been dramatic. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up right on time. The driver greeted her warmly and opened the door like she was royalty. At the private terminal, she stepped aboard Keanu's jet, a quiet, minimalist space with soft gray interiors and the faint scent of lavender. Keanu wasn't there, and she wasn't surprised. He was probably tied up on set or in meetings. She sank into the buttery leather seat by the window and gazed out at the runway as the engines fired up. "Excuse me, may I sit here?" She turned to see a woman about her age, warm-eyed and casually elegant, standing beside her. Her short silver hair was swept back, and her scarf fluttered slightly in the cabin breeze. "Of course," Patricia replied, gesturing to the seat beside her. "I'm Claire," the woman said as she settled in. "Keanu invited me to tag along. I'm heading to California too." "Oh? How do you know my son?" Patricia asked, instantly curious. Claire gave a smile that was just vague enough to be believable. "I've worked with him on some personal design projects, nothing major." Patricia raised an eyebrow, amused. "Well, good luck getting him to make decisions. He still can't pick a paint color without writing a poem about it first." Claire laughed. "Noted." As the jet lifted into the sky, Claire pulled out a small notepad and pen and glanced toward Patricia, her tone soft. "If you don't mind me asking, what's taking you to California?" Patricia sighed. "That's the mystery. Keanu just said it was important, which usually means something's weighing on him." Claire tilted her head gently. "He's lucky to have a mother who listens so closely." "I don't pry," Patricia said. "But I know him. When he uses short sentences, it means something's heavy." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the hum of the jet filling the space between them. Patricia looked down at her hands, gently clasped in her lap. "You know," she said after a long pause, "when Keanu was 7, he used to tape drawings on the wall of little wooden cottages near the ocean. He called them peace houses. He said he'd build me one when he was older." Claire smiled, pen now quietly jotting on her notepad. "Did he?" Patricia chuckled. "He built a lot of things, mostly films and people's respect. But I never asked for a house. I liked what we had. We had love, we had books. That was more than enough." "And what would your perfect house look like?" Claire asked, leaning back casually but noting every word. "Oh, I don't dream like that anymore," Patricia said. "Try me." Patricia stared out the window at the clouds. "Something by the water," she said eventually. "Not too big. Blue curtains. A place where I could grow herbs. Rosemary, lavender, sage. A little spot for a dog, even though I've never owned one. And light. Lots of it. I'm tired of shadows." Claire was quiet, letting those words hang gently in the air. "Sorry," Patricia said after a moment, smiling. "You get to a certain age and you start reminiscing, even when you don't mean to." "No apologies necessary," Claire said, her voice low and kind. "Some memories are blueprints." The plane touched down in Monterey under a clearing sky. The coastal air greeted Patricia like an old friend, salty, crisp, and familiar. She hadn't been to California in years. Another car waited for them outside the terminal. Patricia glanced at Claire, who appeared to be traveling separately now. "I'm heading north," Claire said. "Enjoy your visit." "Thank you," Patricia said, then paused. It was nice talking to someone who doesn't ask about Keanu's movies. Claire gave her a wink. It was nice talking to someone who made him who he is. The car door shut gently behind Patricia and the driver pulled away from the airport. Patricia sat back and exhaled. Her hands still rested in her lap, calm on the outside, but her thoughts were swirling. The trees along the winding road blurred past her window. Redwoods, pines, then cliffs, then, in the distance, the ocean, wide, endless, alive. Her heart stirred. Was this what he meant? She turned to the driver. "Do you know where we're going?" He smiled politely. "I do, ma'am, but I've been instructed not to say. It's a surprise." Patricia laughed. "Of course it is. Always is with that boy." Back at the coastal property, Sophia stood near the edge of the garden, watching the car make its way up the long driveway. Her phone buzzed. Claire's final message. She mentioned blue curtains, rosemary, and ocean views. She's warm, gentle, but she carries more sadness than she lets on. Be ready. Sophia looked toward the house. It was ready. Every detail, down to the shape of the window panes, the hand-painted kitchen tiles, the soft rocking chair on the porch, had been chosen not just to impress, but to remember. Inside, Emily stood by the entryway, holding a key with a red ribbon tied around it. Keanu was upstairs, standing in the room that would be his mother's, gazing out the window at the sea. He didn't move when Sophia entered the room. He just spoke, softly. "Is she here?" "She's 5 minutes out." Keanu closed his eyes for a second. Then he said the words he'd been waiting weeks to speak. "Let's show her what love looks like when you build it out of memories." Patricia stepped off the private jet in Monterey, California, her suitcase in one hand and a puzzled look on her face. The air was crisp and salty, tinged with the faint scent of eucalyptus and sea breeze. She glanced around for Keanu, half expecting him to appear immediately, but instead she was greeted by a driver holding a sign with her name. "Mrs. Patricia Reeves?" he asked warmly, tipping his cap. "Yes, that's me. Right this way, Mr. Reeves is waiting for you." Patricia followed the man to a sleek black SUV, her heart pounding slightly, not with worry, but with anticipation. Keanu hadn't said much in his email, only that she needed to be there by Friday and that it was important. That was it. No other details, not even a clue. And Keanu never did anything without intention. As the car pulled away from the tarmac and began winding through the scenic roads of Big Sur, Patricia took in the towering cliffs, wind-swept cypress trees, and the endless, glittering Pacific below. The view alone felt like a painting, unreal in its serenity. But the real surprise came when they turned onto a private road that sloped gently down a hill, veiled by rows of Monterey pines. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "We're almost there." "There?" Patricia asked, leaning forward slightly. "Where exactly is there?" "You'll see." As the final bend gave way to a clearing, the SUV slowed to a crawl. That's when she saw it. A house, no, a home, rose before her like something out of a dream. It wasn't flashy or overbuilt. It was elegant and modest in scale, but absolutely perfect. The design was warm, modern, and timeless. Sand-colored stone, redwood paneling, and wide glass windows caught the glow of the late afternoon sun. The house was nestled right on the cliff's edge, with an uninterrupted view of the Pacific stretching endlessly beyond. The car came to a stop. Patricia's breath hitched. She stared at the house, blinking hard. This looks like my dream," she whispered to herself. The front door opened, and there he was. Keanu stood on the stone steps, dressed in jeans, a button-down shirt, and a soft expression that made her throat tighten. Beside him stood Emily, her daughter, and unbelievably, Father David, their former pastor from Toronto. She hadn't seen him in over 20 years. Patricia opened the car door slowly and stepped out, her legs slightly wobbly. "Keanu?" she asked, as if unsure he was real. "Hi, Mom," he said, walking down the steps toward her. She could hardly speak. "Is this a resort? What are we doing here?" Keanu smiled and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a single silver key with a soft red ribbon tied through the loop. He held it out to her. "Welcome home, Mom." Patricia stared at the key for a long moment. Her hands began to tremble. She looked from Keanu to the house to the key and back again. "No," she whispered. "You didn't, Keanu, tell me you didn't." "I did," he said, stepping closer, pressing the key gently into her palm. "This is your home. Every part of it was built for you." Her hand clutched the key as tears welled up, streaming down her cheeks, before she could even try to stop them. "No one's ever, I always said." "I remember," Keanu said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me once, when we lived in that tiny apartment off Pape Avenue, when the roof leaked and the floor creaked, that someday you'd love a home by the water. You said you didn't need much, just peace." She broke, right there in his arms. Her knees buckled slightly and he caught her, pulling her into a tight hug. Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, tears falling freely from her eyes too. Even Father David blinked rapidly, overcome with emotion. Patricia sobbed into Keanu's shoulder, clutching him tightly, like she had when he was a boy with scraped knees and dreams bigger than they had money for. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "I wanted to," he said. "You spent your whole life giving. Now it's your turn to receive." For a long while they stood in the driveway, the ocean wind swirling around them, carrying the smell of salt, rosemary, and something unspeakably sacred. Patricia looked over her shoulder at the house again. It didn't look expensive. It looked intentional. Every corner, every beam, every pane of glass. It felt like it was already a part of her. She hadn't even stepped inside, but she already knew it was home. As Keanu led her toward the front door, Emily took her mother's other hand and kissed it. "Come on, Mom," she said, grinning through tears. "Wait until you see the garden." "The garden?" Patricia asked, still dazed. "There's rosemary," Emily said, eyes shining, "and bluebells, and a path lined with pebbles, just like the ones you used to love in Grandmother's backyard." Patricia gasped. "You remember those?" "Of course," Keanu replied. "You remember everything for us. We just returned the favor." They reached the front door. Keanu stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said. With shaking hands, Patricia slipped the key into the lock and turned it. Click. The door opened into a sunlit foyer. Warm light poured through the windows and across polished floors. The scent of cedar wood and fresh flowers filled the air. Patricia stepped inside, slowly, reverently. Her hand trailed along the walls as she took it in. The living room opened before her like a memory made real. Cozy furniture, soft white curtains billowing gently in the ocean breeze, and family photos, her family, already framed on the walls. Keanu had placed a photo of her as a young woman near the fireplace. It was the one where she wore a simple yellow sundress, laughing while holding a tiny baby Keanu in her arms. "How did you..." Emily found your old photo albums, Keanu explained, his voice barely above a whisper. We had them restored. She walked into the kitchen and nearly gasped. The light blue tile backsplash matched a torn magazine clipping she had once taped to her fridge 25 years ago. You even remembered this color. You wrote it down once in a notebook, Emily said. I kept it. Each room unveiled another thoughtful touch. A reading nook filled with Patricia's favorite books, some of them hard to find, now long out of print. A handmade spice rack with her mother's labels recreated. A small, sunlit prayer room with a handmade crucifix on the wall and a kneeler by the window, positioned to face the ocean. Father David walked in and smiled gently. I thought you might want a quiet place to reflect. Patricia placed a hand over her heart. The tour continued, ending in the backyard. The garden was alive with color. Lavender, rosemary, roses, and lemon trees lined the walkway. There was even a small bench shaded by a trellis of vines, perfect for evening tea. But the moment that truly stole her breath was the final stop. There, near the garden, was a small enclosed gazebo with soft, sheer curtains tied to its beams. Inside was a small table and 2 chairs, an exact replica of the spot where she used to have breakfast with her late husband decades ago. Patricia gasped. I remember how you used to sit with Dad, Keanu said. Every morning, coffee and quiet. You once told me it was your favorite part of the day. Patricia nodded, the tears unstoppable now. It was. Keanu held her hand again. Then now you can have that again. Here. In peace. They sat together in the gazebo as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The air was cool, gentle. Everything felt like it was exactly as it should be. Patricia turned to her children and whispered, I don't deserve all this. You do, Mom, Emily said. Keanu looked out at the ocean and spoke quietly. This house isn't just for you. It's for every sacrifice you made, every meal you skipped, every coat you mended so we could have warm clothes. It's not payment, it's gratitude. Patricia reached for his hand. I just wanted you all to have a better life. You gave us that, Keanu said. Now it's our turn to give it back. And as the sun melted into the sea, bathing the house in gold, Patricia finally allowed herself to breathe in this new chapter, a chapter written in love, sacrifice, and the quiet fulfillment of a dream long delayed. She was home. Patricia stood in the entryway, stunned by the view before her. Warm afternoon light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the polished wood floors with golden streaks. The house wasn't lavish in the way of celebrity mansions. No, this was different. It was intimate, familiar. Every corner already felt lived in, like it had always been hers. She took one cautious step forward, then another. Her fingers brushed against a weathered coat rack near the door. This looks just like... She trailed off. Keanu smiled gently. It is. From the old place on Westlake. Remember how it always leaned to one side, but you refused to throw it out? Patricia turned, blinking back tears. Because it was a gift from your father, she whispered. Emily appeared beside her. We had it restored. Every scratch, every wobble. It's still there, just sturdier now. Patricia ran her hand down the post, smiling through her tears. I never thought I'd see it again. They moved into the living room, where a massive window overlooked the Pacific. Keanu stood silently beside her as she took it all in. The ocean waves below crashing against the cliffs, the gulls riding the wind, and the delicate blue curtains that swayed slightly from the breeze. Blue, she murmured. I always said I'd want blue curtains in my dream house. Emily nodded. We found it in one of your journals. You wrote it down years ago, along with about 100 other things. A low laugh escaped Patricia's throat, thick with emotion. I used to scribble those things when you kids were asleep, just little daydreams. Well, Keanu said, placing a hand on her back, we were reading your daydreams like blueprints. The tour continued down a hallway. Patricia paused in front of a large framed photo, a black and white image of her as a young woman in her waitressing uniform, holding a baby Keanu at her hip, grinning despite the weariness in her eyes. Above it, etched into a wooden plaque, were the words, "The woman who built the foundation." I don't remember this photo," she whispered. "That's because Emily found it buried in an old box," Keanu said. "You never framed it. So we did." She stood there silently, her hand resting against the glass. "I remember that day. We had pancakes for dinner because we couldn't afford groceries. I told you kids it was a treat." Her voice broke. "You believed me." Keanu's voice was quiet. "We still do." They stepped into the kitchen next. It took Patricia's breath away. The layout was identical to the kitchen from her childhood home in Canada. Same wraparound counters, same hanging pots above the island. Even the old spice rack, her original one somehow, stood proudly by the stove. Where did you get this?" she asked, touching the spice rack like it was a relic. "I tracked it down on eBay," Emily said, grinning. "One of the old neighbors had it in their garage." "There's thyme in the third jar," Patricia said, stunned. "It used to be your dad's favorite." Keanu pointed to the cabinets. "And behind that door? Your favorite mugs, the ones with the chipped handles? We found those too." Patricia opened it and gasped. "You found everything," she said softly. "We tried," Keanu said, gently. "You gave us your entire life. We wanted to give you something back that felt like home." They moved next to a quiet room off the hall. The door was already open. The first thing she noticed were the books, hundreds of them, lining custom-made oak shelves that reached to the ceiling, her entire collection, preserved and displayed. A cozy reading chair sat by the window, surrounded by light. "My library," she whispered. "You remembered." "Of course," Keanu said. "You always said it would be the first room you design if you had a house of your own." Patricia walked slowly inside, her fingers dancing along the spines. "You even organized them by genre." "Emily insisted," Keanu said with a grin. "And over here," Emily chimed in, pulling open a small sliding door behind one of the shelves. "A hidden tea cabinet with all your blends, even that weird licorice one you used to make when we were sick." Patricia laughed, then covered her mouth, overwhelmed again. "I can't believe you remembered all this." "We didn't remember," Keanu said, stepping beside her. "We never forgot." A few minutes later, they walked out to the garden. Patricia gasped again. It was a perfect square of earth arranged in neat rows. Flowers bloomed in soft pinks and yellows, their petals stretching toward the sun. Tiny vegetables peeked through the soil, and there in the far corner stood a rosemary bush, planted fresh, full and fragrant. This looks like our garden from back in Toronto," she said, stunned. "It's modeled after it," Emily said. "We even found old photos to match the layout." "I used to plant those zinnias with your father," Patricia murmured, her voice trembling. "He said they were the only flower brave enough to grow where nothing else would." "Said that," Keanu nodded. "Right before your anniversary." Patricia blinked, her eyes shimmering. "You remember that?" "I remember everything, Mom." Then, just when she thought her heart couldn't take more, Keanu gently guided her to a small, white-painted door just off the hallway near her bedroom. On it, hand-carved in cursive, was a sign, "The Grace Room." Patricia stared at it. "Grace?" Keanu reached into his pocket and handed her a folded letter. "Open it." Her hands shook as she unfolded the note, written in Keanu's distinctive handwriting. "Dear Mom, this room is named after the thing you gave us the most. Not comfort, not just strength, not even love, though there was always so much of that. You gave us grace. Grace when we had nothing, grace when you were exhausted and still found a way to smile, grace when we failed and you never made us feel small. You once told me you didn't want gifts, just peace. This room is your peace. Love always. Keanu." Patricia lowered the letter slowly, her lips trembling. I thought I thought no one remembered I said that. I did, Keanu said, every word. She stepped into the grace room. It was simple. White walls, soft sunlight, and a single chair beside a fountain that gently trickled water into a stone bowl. There was a painting on the wall, done by Keanu himself. A small girl standing in a field of lavender, her face turned toward the sun. I've never seen this one, she said, mesmerized. I painted it from a dream I had, Keanu said. I think it was you. When you were little. Patricia sat down in the chair and let the silence settle around her. A breeze flowed in through the open window, bringing with it the scent of rosemary and salt water. This room feels like a prayer, she said. It is, Emily whispered, for everything you gave up, for every quiet miracle you worked that no one saw. For the next hour, they sat in silence. Patricia held the letter to her chest, breathing in deeply. The emotions came again, waves of memory and gratitude and wonder. She cried, not from sadness, but from being seen. Fully seen. Every corner of her life remembered and honored. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, Keanu leaned down and kissed the top of her head. You once told me not to forget where I came from, he said softly. I never did. The sun was beginning its slow descent beyond the edge of the Pacific, casting golden streaks across the rippling water. The air carried the cool hush of evening, the breeze playing gently with the white curtains fluttering near the open patio doors. Inside the house, quiet laughter drifted from the kitchen, where Emily and Father David were cleaning up after dinner. But on the back porch, it was just Keanu and his mother, Patricia. She sat wrapped in a shawl on one of the cushioned wooden chairs, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes were on the horizon. There was something different about her tonight. Calm, reflective, as if she were holding something delicate in her heart. Keanu stepped outside with 2 cups of tea and handed one to her. She accepted it with a soft, "Thank you," then patted the seat beside her. They sat in silence for a long moment, just watching the waves. Then, as the sky turned amber and lavender, Patricia reached out and took Keanu's hand. Her grip was firm despite her age, and it made Keanu glance over at her. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice low and a little shaky. Something I never said before. Keanu nodded, his throat tightening slightly. He didn't speak, just squeezed her hand gently, giving her space to continue. When you were born, she said, her eyes still fixed on the water, I was terrified. I had no money, no support, and no idea what I was doing. But I remember looking into your eyes and thinking, he's going to be okay. I'll make sure of it. She turned to face him then, her eyes brimming with emotion. I used to pray every single night that you'd find peace. That whatever life took from you, your father, your privacy, your rest, you'd still find something beautiful in this world. But I never imagined, she paused, her voice catching, that you'd become the kind of man who still needs his mom. Keanu blinked slowly, his face softening. A moment passed. Then came his quiet reply, almost a whisper. Always. That single word hung in the air, like a promise. Patricia smiled through her tears. I never stopped needing you, Keanu said, finally. Even when I left home, even when I was a star. It didn't matter how many people recognized my face or cheered my name. There were nights, quiet nights in hotel rooms, when all I wanted was to hear your voice. Patricia covered her mouth to stifle the sob rising in her throat. Keanu, I didn't know you still carried all that. I carried you, he said gently. You were the reason I didn't give up when everything hurt. You were always the voice in my head telling me I was enough. He looked down at their hands. You were the constant, the one thing in my life that never asked for anything back. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. I didn't have to ask. I already had everything, because I had you and Emily. The moment wrapped itself around them like a blanket. The waves continued to whisper their ancient rhythm below the cliffside, and the stars slowly began to appear in the sky. Then, behind them, the sliding glass door creaked open. Father David stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a towel. He paused, taking in the sight of the two of them sitting close, the sea behind them, the wind calm and reverent. "May I?" he asked softly. Patricia smiled and motioned for him to join them. "Please." He took a seat across from them, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a small silver crucifix. It gleamed in the fading light. "I brought this," he said, "from the church in Toronto. I blessed it just before we left. It's a symbol of everything that brought us to this moment." He looked to Patricia, then to Keanu. "Would you allow me to bless this home?" Keanu nodded. "That's why we asked you to come." Father David stood and extended his hand toward the open space, as if embracing the air around the house. He closed his eyes. "Lord, we thank you for the foundation beneath our feet, for the walls that offer shelter, and for the roof that shields us from the storm. But more than that, we thank you for the hearts that make this a home, for love that never falters, for sacrifice that goes unseen, and for the grace that brings us full circle." Patricia closed her eyes, her lips moving silently with the prayer. "Bless this house, Lord, and all who enter it. May its rooms be filled with laughter, its halls with stories, and its garden with life. Let it be a place where healing happens, where memories are born, and where love, above all else, endures." "Amen," he whispered. Keanu whispered it too. Patricia wiped her cheeks with her shawl, overwhelmed again by the stillness, the significance, the simple beauty of that moment. Father David sat again, folding his hands in his lap. "You built this for her," he said to Keanu, "but in many ways, I think it's also for you." Keanu looked out at the ocean. "Yeah, I think so too." They sat there in peaceful silence for a few minutes more. Patricia finally stood, her joints stiff but her spirit light. "I think I'll go get my journal," she said. "Tonight feels like something I need to write down." "Take your time, Mom," Keanu said, watching her step back inside. Father David gave Keanu a knowing look. "You did more than build a house, Keanu. You gave her a second beginning." Keanu stared into the darkening horizon. "No," he said quietly, "she gave me one." The soft hum of twilight filled the air as the sun dipped just below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the living room. Patricia stood near the fireplace, still overwhelmed by everything she had seen. The garden, the grace room, the ocean view, every detail lovingly crafted to honor her life and her quiet sacrifices. But the night wasn't over yet. "Mom," Emily said gently, stepping forward with a small remote in her hand. "There's one more surprise." Patricia turned, a smile tugging at her lips despite the tears that hadn't stopped since she'd stepped into the house. "Emily," she whispered, "if there's anything more, I'm not sure I can take it." "This one," Emily said, blinking back her own tears, "isn't something you can hold. It's something to feel." Keanu stood nearby, silent, hands tucked into the pockets of his black jeans. He looked tired, but not from physical work. His emotions were carved plainly into the lines on his face. The lights dimmed. The large television above the mantel flickered to life. A soft piano track began to play. And then, grainy footage of an old home video, shot decades ago on a shaky camcorder. Patricia's voice filled the room. "Okay, Keanu, show me what you built." A young Keanu appeared on screen, no older than 9, holding up a cardboard sword and shield. "I'm a knight," he declared proudly. Patricia chuckled softly in real time, a hand pressed over her heart. The video cut to another moment. Christmas morning, torn wrapping paper, squeals of laughter. Emily holding up a doll. Keanu unwrapping a second-hand VHS player with joy that made it look brand new. Then came the sound of Patricia's voice, crackly and faint. "Even if we have nothing, we have each other." Patricia inhaled sharply. She hadn't heard her own voice like that in decades. The footage faded into a montage of Keanu's earliest auditions, blurry, nervous, full of stammering introductions and unsure glances. One showed him sitting in front of a blue backdrop, reciting lines from a scene about a lost son and a worried mother. Then the audio changed. Patricia's voice came back, an old cassette recording she'd once made for a church project. "My dream is simple," she said. "I want my children to know they're loved. I want them to grow up to be good, kind people. And maybe someday they'll have a place of their own where they feel safe." The image shifted again. A photo slideshow now, Patricia through the years, holding newborn Keanu, teaching Emily to sew, standing alone at the bus stop in the rain, dressed in her waitress uniform. There were pictures even she didn't remember anyone taking. Then came footage taken just days before. Her walking through the front door of the Ocean View house, her face registering shock, her voice breaking as she whispered, This is my dream." Patricia covered her mouth, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. The final clip played. It was a video of Keanu recorded at night on the back porch. He looked directly into the camera, his voice soft. "Mom," he said, "this house isn't just a gift. It's a promise that I heard you all those years, that I remember the things you thought no one noticed, that I know what you gave up for us, and I want you to know, we remember, we love you, and now it's your turn." The video faded to black. One final line appeared on the screen, in white text, over a background of the ocean. "Even if we have nothing, we have each other. Patricia Reeves." The room fell silent. Patricia sat back slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Her body trembled with emotion. She looked around the room, at Keanu, Emily, and Father David, who had quietly returned to witness the final moment. I didn't know anyone remembered that quote," she whispered. Keanu walked to her side, kneeling down in front of her, like he was still that young boy with the cardboard sword. "Of course we remembered, Mom," he said. "You were the one who got us through everything." Patricia wrapped her arms around him tightly. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that said more than any words could. When they finally pulled apart, Keanu brushed her tears with the back of his hand and rose to his feet. "Will you excuse me?" he said softly, his voice cracking. "Just need a second." He stepped out onto the porch, overwhelmed. Inside, Patricia held the remote in her hands, staring at the black screen, still trembling from the impact of the tribute. Emily sat beside her, quietly placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. "You did this?" Patricia whispered. Emily nodded. "Sophia found the old footage. Claire got voice recordings from your old cassette tapes. We wanted to give you back some of the memories you gave us." Patricia reached for her daughter's hand and squeezed it tightly. Out on the porch, Keanu leaned on the railing, looking out over the water. The sky was turning indigo now. The last sliver of sun slipped beneath the waves. He heard the door creak open behind him. Patricia stepped out quietly. For a few seconds, they both just looked at the ocean. "I thought I had cried everything out," she said, voice low. Keanu gave a half laugh, eyes still glassy. "Me too." Patricia stepped beside him and looked up at the stars beginning to emerge above the waves. "This is the life I prayed for," she whispered. Keanu turned, placing an arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his chest. They stayed that way until the stars came out in full. Nothing more needed to be said. The moment had already said it all. If this story moved you, even just a little, take a moment to reflect on the quiet heroes in your own life. The ones who gave without asking, who loved without limits. And if Patricia's dream coming true brought a tear to your eye, help us share that light. Like the video, subscribe for more stories that touch the soul, and send this to someone who needs a reminder. Love always finds a way home.